As President Bush's approval ratings dive to a new low, he faces mounting calls to pull out US troops from Iraq. With support for the war ebbing away, will he be forced to change course? What will happen to Iraq once the troops leave? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. Well, they say the new buzzword in the corridors of the White House is post-surge redeployment, with a Republican tide apparently turning against him. Just how much longer can President Bush hold out without making a firm declaration on his future course in Iraq? Two of his top men in the field were due to report in September on the effectiveness of the troop increase Mr. Bush announced in January. But one of them, Ryan C. Crocker, the US ambassador to Iraq, is already warning that a withdrawal could lead to a massive increase in violence. The other, General David Petraeus, in charge of US forces there, is stating that a successful end to the conflict will need a military presence for many years. On what's been one of the bloodiest weeks yet in Iraq, with 150 killed and 250 wounded by a truck bomb at a market in the north, a new poll shows US opposition to the war is at a record high. More than 7 in 10 Americans are now said to favor withdrawing most troops by next April. It comes as the US Senate debates changes to the annual military budget designed to put pressure on the White House to start pulling forces out of Iraq. And whilst Mr. Bush retains much Republican support for the war, dissent within his party is growing, adding to the increasing pressure from the Democrats. Most Republicans don't want a specific date for troop withdrawal, but there are signs of cracks in Bush's support. 3 Republican senators have said they'll consider voting for legislation that will set a binding date for getting troops out of Iraq. And other Republicans are now saying a change of course in Iraq is necessary and are calling for US troops to move away from combat roles. Democrats remain firm, pointing to what they see as a worsening situation in Iraq as reason to make a decision about troop withdrawal now.
The war in Iraq is headed in a very dangerous direction. The last 3 months of President Bush's surge have been the deadliest of the war, the entire war. The surge was supposed to provide Iraq political leaders the space to make the compromises necessary to unite this nation. It hasn't happened, despite the bravery of our troops. Democrats, military experts, and the American people know the President's current strategy is not working, that we cannot wait until September to act.
And the White House, however, brushed away claims of a discussion of a troop withdrawals and defended their strategy.
There is no intensifying discussion about reducing troops. What there is a real, again, you were talking about a surge that literally just got completed in terms of troop complements 2 weeks ago.
And in an interview with the New York Times, the US ambassador to Iraq cited the possible dangers of a premature US troop withdrawal. He warned of a resurgence by al-Qaeda forces in Iraq. The risk that Iraq's security forces of 350,000 would collapse under sectarian pressures, and interference in Iraq by bordering countries such as Iran and Turkey. Well, joining us now are guests in Washington, Phyllis Bennis, Director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. In London, Sabah Al-Mokhtar, an Iraqi expert. And here in Doha, Scott Bates, Vice President of the Centre for National Policy. Scott Bates, let me start with you here in Doha, if I may. So the US ambassador to Iraq warning of the perils of a premature US troop withdrawal. Is he right? Should the troops stay for now?
Well, Darren, I think the ambassador is right in saying that if U.S. troops left, say, within the next few months, there'd be a security vacuum that would only be filled with violence and chaos. I think that's an accurate estimation. The real question is, will the U.S. presence in the long term create more stability in Iraq? And that's a whole other issue. I think that the current surge is not really a surge, and you hear it in the voice of the White House spokesman there, well, we've only been at it for 2 weeks. This is just a bad sales job. This surge was never going to really secure Iraq. General Shinseki said 4 years ago that job would require about 500,000 U.S. combat troops. There's not the political will for that, and so a new way has to be found, and right now the surge is not working, so it's time for Plan B, and unfortunately it doesn't sound like there's a Plan B on the shelf right now.
Sab al-Mokhtar in London, so the US ambassador to Iraq saying there could be a total collapse of Iraq's security forces and a massive increase in the violence if the troops do pull out. He's right, isn't he?
Well, thanks to him, the situation in Iraq is not all that good, which makes him proud of what they are achieving. One would have to ask what the Americans are doing there. What are they achieving? They have been there for 4 years. They are building walls within the city. They are banning people from moving. They're talking about a surge, and the killing is intensifying. The idea that of the Americans, as long as the Americans are there, and the Iraqis will never have peace. And unless the US Army stands down, the Iraqi army will never be able to deal with the situation, because this is not an army that they have created. They have amalgamated militias together who have no national agenda, and the American troops are themselves being one of the militias.
Phyllis Bennis in Washington, are Ambassador Crocker's fears well-founded? I mean, will it be a disaster if they do pull out?
It's a disaster now. The question, will there be a short-term escalation in violence? I think there probably will be, but I don't think anyone really knows exactly what will happen when the troops pull out. What we do know is that the Iraqi people in the area of 65 to 80% want the US troops to be pulled out immediately, and in overwhelming majorities say they will feel safer if the American troops are gone. So I think that's the message we need to hear. Clearly that does not match what the Iraqi government is saying, any more than what the American people are saying. Over 70% saying the US troops must get out, matches what the Bush administration is saying. So in both countries, we have a huge disconnect between the people and the governments. And I think that the reality is, what has not changed since this invasion and war began is that it was illegal from the beginning, something grudgingly admitted to by the Secretary General of the United Nations, that the invasion was illegal. The illegality has not changed. And the failure was written in from the very beginning. So the notion that somehow staying longer is going to make the situation better simply begs the reality. What you do when you have a situation like this, it's not what Colin Powell used to talk about of the so-called pottery barn analogy about we broke it, we have to fix it. What you really do when you've broken something, it's like the bull in the china shop. What do you do when the bull gets loose in the china shop and breaks all the dishes? You don't leave the bull in the china shop and ask the bull to fix the dishes. You get the bull out of the china shop and write a check for the damage. That's step one of what the US needs to do to make good on our obligations to the people of Iraq.
Okay, let's bring in back Scott Bates in Doha, because we'll discuss the military options just a little bit later. But in terms of US political support for the war, Mr. Bush now faces even more defections from within his own party over support for the war. That's pretty damning, though, isn't it?
Well, it is, but I wouldn't read a lot into it in the sense that you have to listen very carefully to Senator Lugar's statements and those of Senator Warner. Those are the really Republican senators that get so much respect from all senators on the Senate floor, and they are saying there needs to be a new strategy. They aren't saying we need to get out in 3 months or 6 months. They don't want to see American failure in Iraq. And so I think they're saying to the president, look, your surge did not work. We have to look for a more sustainable type of deployment. And I think that might be in the realm of something even some Democrats are talking about, and an idea I've had for a while, which is that there's a residual presence that is not patrolling the streets of Iraq, generating that kind of ill will, but instead it's there training Iraqi security forces, and it's available to strike at al-Qaeda, but in very limited operations. So I don't foresee, you know, Republicans suddenly shifting over and pulling the plug on the war generally.
Sabra al-Mokhtar in London, let's stay with the Washington politics for a minute, because there are suggestions within Washington that perhaps Mr. Bush should preempt more Republican defections now by announcing his intentions to begin a phased withdrawal from Iraq. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't. And quite frankly, I think what's happening in Washington, it's internal domestic politics. It's nothing to do with the war in Iraq. I don't think the Americans will pull out, even if President Bush tomorrow declares that he's going to pull the troops out. We are looking at a situation where you have the biggest embassy in history in Baghdad. You have the largest air bases being built in Iraq. This is not the intention of a country that is leaving a territory that they have occupied. So this is just for domestic politics, they are doing all these discussions. I think at the end of the day, even the Democrats, if they come to power, they will not withdraw from Iraq. They are talking about relocation, reducing numbers, putting them out of the theater of operation, i.e. putting them in bases, but that will never ever solve the problem of Iraq. At the present moment, Iraq has one common enemy, and the common enemy is the occupier. Regardless of whatever anybody says about it, this is an occupation force. The only people who are supporting it are the people who have been brought in by the occupation. So of course they would want the Americans to stay, because otherwise they will have to leave before them. And I would suggest that if the Americans even announce that they are going to reduce the troops, many of those people we see in Baghdad sitting in judgment and in offices, they will leave before the Americans do.
Phyllis Bennis in Washington, we're hearing more about this buzzword, post-surge deployment, which seems to be bouncing around Washington these days. I mean, does this mean that the troop surge itself has failed, as Scott Bates in Doha seems to think, and that the White House is now looking beyond the surge and beyond that?
I think the surge failed before it even began, because the invasion and the war failed before they even began. But I do think that what we're seeing, unfortunately, is an emerging bipartisan potential agreement on a strategy that many of us have warned against, which is very much, as we just heard, a partial withdrawal. I think the U.S. does not want to have a permanent deployment of 150,000 troops in Iraq, but they do want to have a significant permanent deployment with permanent bases and control of the oil. To my way of thinking, that probably means withdrawing about half the troops with great fanfare, and then with very little fanfare, having somewhere between 60 and 80,000 troops remain on the ground in Iraq in these huge bases that are being constructed throughout the country, as well as just over the borders in other countries in the region, remaining an occupying force indefinitely. Hillary Clinton has used the term indefinitely for describing how long U.S. troops will be in Iraq. This is not only the White House. There are differences between the parties on how far they will go in talking about a withdrawal, but I don't think, and I agree, that we are not talking about a situation in which either of the mainstream parties as a whole are prepared to look at total U.S. withdrawal. The Iraqi people in all the polls seem to indicate they also don't believe that even if their government asked the U.S. To pull out the troops, they don't believe that the Americans would pull out the troops. I don't either.
OK, well, time for a short break now, but when we come back, we'll discuss whether the US military option is producing any gains at all. Stay with us, won't you?